Thank you, Hanko. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming today. And kind of want this talk to be somewhat interactive if possible. So if you have any questions, stop me at any time. Just shout it out or raise your hand. It's about an issue that is really salient, as we like to say, very prominent in the news today, and talked about by all of our political candidates, including Donald Trump. I'm sure there'll be some Donald Trump questions after this, so I feel free to ask those. Much of the talk is going to be about what we do in political science, which is not necessarily talking about what's right or wrong, but trying to explain why things happen the way they do in politics. So how do people think and opine about politics? And in this case, we're going to talk about immigrants and immigration policy. So again, thank you to Hanko and the Library Speaker Series. I'm really privileged. I'm really happy to be here, and I feel really fortunate and lucky to be able to be a part of this very prestigious speaker series. I'm here presenting work that I'm co-authoring, where I'm the lead author on our forthcoming book. It's going to be published in August of this year, called Framing Immigrants, News Coverage, Public Opinion, and Policy, with my co-authors from the University of California, Riverside, and Jennifer Merola, formerly of Claremont Graduate University in Los Angeles. So let's see. So as I had said, immigration has really been a very salient or prominent and contentious topic in the United States today, with a great deal of congressional debate, a little bit of media hoopla, and a bunch of advocacy efforts devoted to this issue. The past decade in particular has seen a raft of legislative proposals and news media coverage to try to solve this growing problem of illegal and undocumented immigration. What we are interested in today and in this book is examining media coverage and public opinion on the issue. And many of the studies that have come before us have done one or the other, and we want to connect the two in some way on the topic of immigration. And while the public doesn't necessarily always directly shape policy outcomes, and what public opinion doesn't necessarily shape public policy outcomes, politicians absolutely do care about what the public thinks, particularly in election years. So the conventional wisdom is that public opinion on the issue of immigration is generally stable, with most Americans holding very restrictive attitudes on immigration, and the issue itself being not very prominent in the news all the time. At certain times, it can be very salient. In political science, we say salient. That means prominent. That means out there. And at other times, it can just fade back into the ether, and other more important other issues may take precedence, such as terrorism or the economy. But where so this conventional wisdom about immigration not really being immigration being very stable in terms of its opinion, where is this coming from? Where is this conventional wisdom coming from? And what's really underlying these kind of conclusions? Well, it's being derived primarily from survey data, polls that a lot of us may or may not take. They're drawing upon questions that may be worded in different ways. So there are a number of questions that we really need to ask ourselves in terms of, is this this is the polling data right here. As you see, the red line over there shows the Americans who think that the level of immigration should be decreased. The blue line down here, that immigration should be increased, and staying the same is the gray line, and so that's where it's coming from. This is this generally kind of negative kind of opinion about immigration writ large in America. And while policy debates over illegal immigration have taken on several new and interesting dimensions since the turn of the century, since 2000, much opinion research still analyzes Americans' views on immigration in a fairly blunt manner. In terms of the importance of immigration as an issue, number one, and number two, whether Americans want to increase, decrease, or keep it the same. But what we argue here is that immigration is much broader, it's much more complex, it's much more nuanced than just trying to talk about immigration in those two very simplistic terms. The policy outcomes themselves, if you can see here, this is just basically the same graph just cut off a little closer. Much research has explored the factors that may influence public opinion along these dimensions, including the influence of such factors as perceptions of economic threat, beliefs about Americanism, and also the framing of racial and ethnic cues. However, the policy outcomes themselves, again, remain fairly stable. Blunt measures that fail to capture, again, the complexity of the policy debate and the media coverage and discourse on immigration in this new century. If we turn to support for particular policies, we find that opinions seem much less stable and oftentimes contradictory. For example, this Quinnipiac University poll from July of 2012 shows that while 55% of respondents favor giving undocumented children legal status, right, deferred action from deportation, 64% of those same respondents favored a policy that would deport these same children, right? This is what we mean by sometimes there is contradiction in public opinion, and specifically with respect to policy, right? Notice the use of the terms children and young in this DACA question here. DACA meaning deferred action for childhood arrivals. And their absence from the Arizona question. Are these inconsistencies and differences in public opinion on these policy issues, are they due in part to differences in how these questions are being asked? Or in our lingo, how these questions are being framed, how these policies are being framed? And if so, to what extent? So this all leads up to the motivation for our book, in which we draw upon a few important characteristics regarding the issues of undocumented immigrants. First, we point out that in the immigration policy debate, it's gotten much, much more complex, as I said. No longer is it just about increasing or decreasing or keeping immigration at the same levels. It's about legal immigrants and illegal immigrants and undocumented immigrants and illegal aliens. It's about deportation policies. It's about the DREAM Act, birthright citizenship, a temporary guest worker program. You might have heard of some of these policies. Refugee policies, and many more. It's no longer that simple anymore. And many of these policies have been broken out from a larger package that used to be called comprehensive immigration reform. Second, as the debate shifted to more specific policies, as I suggested, public opinion has become less well-grounded. In particular, we know that the public is relatively uninformed about many of these different policies. And while most Americans can actually report an opinion on, say, something like the DREAM Act or deportation, few can accurately describe the particulars of each of those policies or even go into much depth. So says public opinion surveys. Additionally, the parties' stances on these policies are not entirely clear. For instance, it was a Republican president who was the last who led the last major push for what we call comprehensive immigration reform, including a lot of these policies together packaged in one that President Bush tried to get through the Congress in 2005 and 6, or 6 and 7. Only to be thwarted, President Bush, a Republican, only to be thwarted by a Republican House that refused to pass his bill on immigration. And while some Wall Street and agricultural Democrats might want something like a temporary guest worker program to be able to allow their businesses to thrive, you have big labor Democrats who have a lot of reservations about allowing or granting work permits without legal status to people to immigrants that may undercut working wages. So what we argue in this context is that the ways in which immigrants and policies are framed will likely prove very consequential for public opinion. For one, how immigrants are framed is important. Are they framed as illegal, undocumented, unauthorized, illegals, aliens? Does that matter? And to what extent? Second, how policies are framed. Is it called a pathway to citizenship? Is it called amnesty? Right? Is it called the DREAM Act? There are different things that matter, and these are different frames that could matter. So this is what we looked at in our book. Very few scholars have looked at linkages between the framing in the media and public opinion. And what we seek to do in this book is examine both the content of media frames alongside their effect on public opinion on these different policies. So first, what I want to do is, I don't want to confuse people. There's a lot of jargon in here, and I apologize for that. But I want to take a step back and talk about what frames are. Oops. So what are frames? Well, frames are the way in which the media organizes the facts and the opinions presented in a given story, focusing on certain, what we call considerations. You could think of them as information or points, rather than others. Frames can alter the weight weight given to different pieces of information or considerations when people actually form their opinions. So for example, if the media coverage focuses on immigrants taking jobs away from US citizens, people or the public may become less supportive of a pathway to citizenship for those undocumented immigrants, as opposed to media focusing on the United States as a nation of immigrants, and this is who we are, right? So if those stories are presented, two separate stories, you may get two different results in terms of how people interpret those facts and the opinions they report after they've read them. That said, there are different types of frames. I haven't really been specific about the different types of frames, and in our book we focus on three specific types of frames. First, equivalency frames, issue frames, and episodic and thematic framing. Equivalency framing are logically equivalent phrases with variation in wording that can cause individuals to alter their opinions. So the quick, easy example from healthcare is Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, right? Different words, same policy, okay? Pathway to citizenship and amnesty. Illegal, undocumented, unauthorized, right? Different words, same thing. Equivalency framing, number two, is logically equivalent, issue framing is where situations where emphasizing a certain subset of information or considerations, a speaker leads individuals, as Druckmann says, to focus on these considerations when constructing their opinions. So if you emphasize the nation of immigrants as opposed to the costs of these immigrants because they take advantage of programs that they shouldn't, or they don't pay taxes, or they're criminals, those are different things that a journalist, a politician, can write about and talk about that could get individuals, could get people to think about the issue differently, right? And finally, in terms of episodic and thematic framing is when episodic frames are much more concrete frames. Individual stories about real people. Oftentimes they involve stories about an individual person, Chris Haynes or Ellen or someone else. Thematic framing is a lot different. It's much more generalized, right? It's about, oftentimes they use statistics. They aggregate, they add up a lot of different pieces of information. They talk about it very generally. So this all leads up to the primary questions that we explore in this book. So what are the research questions that we look at? First, how are undocumented immigrants and immigration policies framed in the media? And this is with respect to, we look at three here. We look at the DREAM Act, we look at immigrant legalization, and we look at deportation. Okay? Second, does this framing vary across different media outlets? Right? Media outlets meaning CNN, or MSNBC, or Fox News, or the Washington Post, the Washington Times. Third, are these frames consequential for public opinion? Do they matter? Do they shift opinion in a more supportive direction or in a more opposing direction with respect to these different policies? And fourth, and finally, do these framing effects vary by different groups of people? Do they vary across different individuals? Do Republicans react differently than Democrats? Do whites react differently than Latinos? Do immigrants who have been here who are part of the fourth generation different than those immigrants that are here as a first generation immigrant in terms of how they think? Okay? So what I'd like to do first is to lay out our primary expectations and how we actually attack this, our methods, for both the media's framing of immigration on one hand and for the framing effects on public opinion and immigration on the other. Now, in terms of media framing, we don't have very clear expectations for what types of frames that we thought we would find. That said, given the more restrictive attitudes that are generally out there on immigration, and that has changed over time, and so you have to think about this study started in 2007, right? And this is right after comprehensive immigration reform went down to defeat twice, okay? There was a lot of really negative press on undocumented immigrants, and this is the context within which this project kind of took form. But in terms of that, and given the more restrictive attitudes, we might expect terms like illegal to be more prominent in the media than, say, undocumented or unauthorized. As well as more negative rationales or arguments or reasons why we shouldn't implement maybe progressive or permissive, you want to call it, immigration policies like the DREAM Act or giving undocumented immigrants citizenship. However, what we thought is, over time, these differences, these negative attitudes may soften. In terms of our methodological approach, in terms of how we gather data, right? We looked at 7 different news sources in the media in the media project. We looked at CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the Post and Times from Washington, and the Post and Times from New York, trying to gather a nice variety of information to be able to describe how the media covers undocumented immigrants. 2 types of analyses. Apologize for the ugly slide. We used a quantitative search, so we used LexisNexis and looked and searched for terms like illegal or illegal aliens or undocumented, right? In any article that was on one of the 3 policies. So in any article that dealt with a pathway to citizenship, in any article that dealt with the DREAM Act, or deportation, right? Quantitative searches to see the percentage of articles from that news organization that used, let's just say, the word illegal immigrant in them in DREAM Act stories. We also did qualitative content analyses. So from that search, we downloaded random samples, sometimes interval samples, of articles in 2007, 10, 12, and 13 to try to read through them and code them for different qualitative kind of measures, such as what's the tone of this article? Is it positive, negative, neutral? Things that cannot really be accurately kind of or figured out by a quantitative search, right? We had to read the article. Types of arguments for the DREAM Act and against the DREAM Act. It's really difficult to kind of put a search term in there and just voila, press a button and it comes out. There's going to be a lot of inaccuracies. So what we did is I read hundreds or thousands of articles on immigration. Let's just put it that way. Finally, in the analysis, we looked at a comparison of different frequencies, the proportions. And in this talk today, I'll concentrate on considerations or arguments for or against the different policies, and also certain terms that were highlighted in the coverage, such as illegal, child, amnesty, and those types of things. We also in the content analysis looked at emotional content, coded for empathy, coded for anxiety and anger. Also looked at episodic and thematic framing, and finally, as I suggested earlier, the tone. But not only do we want to know how the media covers immigrants and immigration policy, but we also are very interested in how these differences, how these frames affect public opinion, right? And so this is why we had our second part of the project, looking and doing survey experiments, right? Surveying the public and altering the different frames that we give them in questions to see if they do have an effect on support for these policies. First, with respect to equivalency framing, we expect that the illegal immigrant frame, so if you call them illegal immigrants as opposed to undocumented, that might lead to more restrictionist attitudes than the alternative frames. Second, regarding issue framing, given that public opinion is pretty fluid on particular policies, we expect framing to be very consequential here for public opinion, especially when frames are one-sided, so if you only get one point of view. If they are strong, they're in your face, that's the only thing you read. They're novel, so they're pretty new maybe. And when the policy is less well known or undefined. You know, how many of you know what the DREAM Act is? Can you raise your hands? So that's what I would call a novel issue in this room, okay? And undefined, right? In that context, frames can really matter, right? Frames can serve as shortcuts for people that don't know about policies, don't know about candidates, right? To make decisions. You know, a lot of us do the same thing. Well, and I'm not sure how many partisans are in this group, but if you don't know a candidate that's on the ballot, oftentimes people will refer to their party to figure out whether they want to vote for that person or not. And finally, in terms of variation in framing effects, we expect that people may reject frames that are inconsistent with their predispositions. Predispositions are things like partisanship. Okay? They may reject frames that are not consistent with their party, and accept frames that are consistent with their party or their prior opinions. Right? We know from psychology that people like to hear things that they already agree with, right? They like to be told that they're right in general. And so this is kind of undergirding this expectation here. We also expect families, so in addition to partisanship conditioning this relationship, we also expect immigrant generation to do the same. Those who are further removed from the immigrant experience, meaning the third, fourth generation immigrants, right, may be less empathetic and thus less susceptible to negative restrictive frames than, or actually more susceptible to negative restrictive frames than immigrants or newer immigrants. And I hope I won't bore you with this, but in terms of the methodology and the survey experimental portion, where we're trying to figure out the effect of these frames in public opinion, we had two different choices. There are two potential ways we could have done this. In one approach, we could try to link the actual media content that we find using, say, a search term, and link that to public opinion surveys that have been done, right? However, this approach is fraught with a number of issues. Number one, we're trying to look at opinion on policies that are, not necessarily always polled. The DREAM Act, deportation does get a decent amount of coverage, but it is not consistent. So it's difficult to link them to that. Second, we wouldn't be able to discern which media outlets people pay attention to if we did it this way. And finally, we wouldn't be able to isolate and estimate the effects of specific frames, illegal, undocumented, amnesty, pathway, using this method. The alternative approach would be to run survey experiments in which we randomly assign people to different immigration frames. So it's as if I gave the survey to all of you, and people on this side of the room got the word illegal in their question about the DREAM Act, and this side of the room got undocumented. Then I'd ask you to what extent you supported the DREAM Act, and we could see, right, which one, if it made a difference. And I'm just assuming that you all are randomly assigned to these two different sides, right? That's the approach that is the alternative. But again, there's some issues there too. First, this approach is not necessarily directly connected to the media that people are watching, right? So we really can't directly connect it to the content analysis, okay? Also, since it would really involve some simple wording experiments, the external validity, could be somewhat questionable. I mean, on the flip side, the first alternative, you have issues with what we call internal validity. Are you really measuring what you're measuring? That all said, what we did is we decided on the second approach. And this leads us to the structure of our book. Start off in our book with an introductory chapter. We talk about our theory regarding framing and how it affects public opinion and how frames are presented in the media. And then it leads up into 4 what we call empirical chapters. Does anybody know what an empirical chapter is? Okay, jargon, sorry. Empirical chapters are chapters where we're testing our questions, testing our hypotheses or our expectations, right, with real data that we gather, okay? Meaning we did a bunch of survey experiments to try to figure out on the DREAM Act whether different frames, different ways to frame the DREAM Act have a differential impact on support for the DREAM Act. Those are our empirical chapters. So we do an empirical chapter on the DREAM Act and DACA, which is closely related, legalization, deportation, and a final one looking at the terms used to describe immigrants. So in our first empirical chapter, what we do is we take up the DREAM Act, or the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act. This was originally introduced by Republican Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah and Dick Durbin, Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, a Democrat, in 2001. When is it, 2016? Yeah, 15 years ago. Not passed yet, by the way. It was by far the most popular, and still remains the most popular component, well, unless you talk about border enforcement, of comprehensive immigration reform that I referred to earlier, and enjoyed majority support even among Republicans as late as 2007, after the bill went down to a significant defeat. Then after CIR failed to pass in 2006 and 7, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid revived it briefly in 2010 during the lame duck session in the Senate. This is after the election. So after November's election, we have something called the lame duck session, right? Because you might have some senators who went up for re-election who lost, right? So there's still a session after the election before the new senators take office in January, right? During this lame duck session, that's when Harry Reid actually brought the bill back up. Part of the reason why was because Hispanic voters were instrumental in his victory that year. But unfortunately for proponents of the DREAM Act, right, it didn't get enough support. It failed on what we call a cloture motion. You may not know what cloture is, but does everyone know what a filibuster is? Maybe? Filibuster in the Senate when you talk a bill to death. Well, you need 60 votes to break a filibuster, and that's a cloture motion. So the cloture motion failed. They only got 55 votes out of 100, and you need 60. And interestingly, its original sponsor did not support that cloture motion. Orrin Hatch was still, the Republican was still in the Senate and did not support it at that time. But finally in 2012, after the Democratic Party's resounding victory, re-electing President Obama with strong Latino support, and after continued protests by Dreamers, a lot of the Dreamers are just undocumented immigrant children who are protesting, right, to try to get legal status for themselves or people like them. The DREAM Act was once again made part of the political agenda. And if I wasn't clear, the DREAM Act is a piece of legislation or a policy that would give a pathway to citizenship for undocumented minors that came to the United States before they were a certain age. Now that age varies with the policy, but generally like 16 or under. What happened was, after the 2012 election, and you might remember that when Obama got reelected, there's a lot of talk about how the Republicans failed with Latinos, right? That they need to reevaluate how they are approaching the whole situation. And that if they don't change, if they don't come around to passing comprehensive immigration reform, they're never going to win the presidency ever again, right? And they're doomed to failure. So in this context, there was a certain gang of senators that got together and tried to negotiate a compromised comprehensive immigration reform bill. Within this context, Marco Rubio, who kind of balked at it because he thought he was going to run for president, well, he kind of did, said, I don't want any part of this bill, but I'm going to propose my own DREAM Act. The only difference was his DREAM Act would not give citizenship to these minors. It would just grant legal status, right? A big difference, meaning you can't vote, and there are a couple other things you can't do. After that, and to Rubio's kind of dismay, President Obama went ahead and proposed and wrote an executive order called DACA. And if you're not familiar with DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, right? This is in the summer of 2013. But does anybody know what DACA is? What is DACA?
It's basically similar to the DREAM Act, except instead of granting citizenship, it just protects the undocumented children or minor, however you want to say, for 2 years from being deportation. Yeah,
it does shield, right? It shields, it shifts the prosecutorial focus away from certain populations that, this is how Obama would explain it, right? Not as dangerous, not high risk, right? And part of those populations were undocumented immigrant children, right? So it shielded them from deportation. And it also gave them an ability to register and work, right? This is in the news yesterday and today, right? What's happening with this in the news? What does anybody know what Jeannie? I don't mean Jeannie, but Jackie.
And the Supreme Court is considering this question.
Yes, the Supreme Court, made up of 8 justices, is considering DACA at this very moment, and so that's one of the big pieces of big cases that are currently before the Supreme Court. And the reason it's so significant is because we only have 8 justices on there, right? Because the Republican Senate, will not confirm another justice, and Antonin Scalia died. So you have 4 liberals and 4 conservatives, and most observers think that this policy, it'll end with a 4-4 decision, right? So which means that it probably will not be implemented, and it'll still be a stay because the lower court actually ruled against DACA, came up in Texas, right? And so what happens when you have a 4-4 tie in the Supreme Court is the previous decision on the lower court stands, whether that's from an appellate court or district court, right? Generally from an appellate court. So anyways, in the news. So all that said, President Obama proposed this policy, right? And this is kind of like the context from which, or these are the policies that we're talking about in this chapter. So first, we take up the media's general use of children and matters of public policy. And so I'm kind of taking a slight step back here. And while we notice that mentions of children most often coincide with liberal policy actions, right? When you mention a child, you might think of liberal policy kind of issues. There are a few instances here where, children have been mentioned in support of more conservative causes, right? So it's not always for a liberal cause. Second, with respect to the amnesty frame, we have reason to suspect that its use will be primarily among conservative networks or immigration opponents, right? We do know of this memo here that was circulated back in 2005 by Republican campaign strategist, or Frank Luntz, instructing Republican candidates to use the term amnesty, because back then amnesty was caustic. I guess it's still caustic now, right? It's toxic in their campaigns, and to talk about it in terms of the violation of American values, violation of the rule of law, and of criminality. So what do we find regarding the use of children in DREAM Act stories, given these expectations? And as expected, given the policy, references to children are high across all media markets. Does this have a little thing? No, not. Across all media markets. Child mentioned in DREAM Act stories, right? This is what we're trying to figure out. Of all the DREAM Act stories from 2007 to 2013, what percentage included the word child? And so that makes sense, right? Because this is a policy that targets children. That being said, references are lower in print media as well as in conservative media. So the conservative media organizations, if you're not aware, are the Washington Times, the New York Post, and obviously Fox News Channel. Okay? So what do we find also with respect to the amnesty frame? In all stories about the DREAM Act, what percentage of those stories included the word amnesty, right? So you can tell this came from a quantitative word search, right? It is less frequently connected to the DREAM Act, but when it is invoked, it is more often used in conservative outlets, like the Times and the Fox News Channel, right? Over time, we see a decline in amnesty mentions, and you can't see that here. It's a separate graph. But we do see amnesty mentions decline over time in this data set from 2007 to 13, while child mentions stay relatively stable throughout. Okay? Given the prominence of the media's use of the child and amnesty frames, we then conducted a series of survey experiments, our second part of the project, from 2007 to 2014, using both the Cooperative Congressional Election Study and a nationally representative polymetric study. Okay, we conducted a lot of survey experiments throughout this process to try to replicate, findings that we had initially. We wanted to test our expectations that child mentions would increase support for the DREAM Act and amnesty mentions would decrease support for the DREAM Act, right? We focused on the differences in average support for the DREAM Act between survey respondents receiving the amnesty, one group, the child frame, another group, and no mention, nothing in the third group, right? Here's the DREAM Act question wording that includes what we call 3 split sample randomizations. So if 3 split samples, meaning 1 sample here, 2 here, so I split this entire group of people into 3 different groups. And I randomly place each of you in one of these 3 groups, the back area, the left, and the right. That's what I mean by a split sample randomization. We had 3 different experiments going on so that each group would not affect each other. We looked at the amnesty frame in one, the child frame in another, and illegal, undocumented, and unauthorized in the third, right? So we wanted to look at strongly worded frames. Because if the child frame and the amnesty frame were in the same group, you may not have the same effects. You may not be able to estimate the effect of each individual frame because they're in it together. So we separated them. So how does this mention of children in the survey question affect DREAM Act support? And I apologize if you're too far away to see and they're kind of small. But overall, DREAM Act opinion in the control group, which is the, I don't know what color that is, gray, is always supportive, right? So if it's on the right side of the 0, that means it's supportive, okay? If it's on the left side, it means opposing the DREAM Act. And you see the gray area is always generally in support of the DREAM Act, meaning most Americans, and this is from a nationally representative sample, so most Americans are generally supportive of the DREAM Act. This is not including the child frame, though, right? When you include the child frame, the red bar, whatever color that is, right, is what happens. So you see that in 3 different surveys, 2014, 10, and 7, there's a significant increase in support, right, when you put the word child in the question about the DREAM Act, as opposed to not having it, right? I mean, there's one obvious outlier there, and that's 2012, right, where they're generally the same level of support, right? Why is that the case? Stop. One reason for the weaker effects in 2012 kind of goes back to why I wouldn't want to put the child and amnesty frame together. And what happened in that sample is we actually gave the same group of respondents both the child, and some of them got the amnesty frame as well. Some of them did not, right? So they had 2 competing frames, and the effects were not as large in that sample. But if you look at only those individuals in 2012 that received only the child frame, right, the number is 0.51, very consistent with the other results. So in short, we find strong and consistent support for the positive effect of mentioning children in DREAM Act questions. I mean, what does this mean, really? I mean, I'll talk to you about this in the implications, but if you're a politician, right, and you're wanting to build support for policies like the DREAM Act, you better mention children, right? There are certain things that you can and cannot do, and that would be advantageous to you, right? I mean, we'll relate this to Trump later on. Next slide. So the other question is, do these results, and this is the fourth research question, vary by partisan identification, right? Do Democrats react differently than Republicans that react differently than independents? And in 2007, the wording "came as young children" in the question has a similar effect in boosting support for the DREAM Act across all partisan groups. Okay? This is the control at 0. Boosting support, boosting support, boosting support upon all partisan groups. So there is a little bit of moderation there because, as you see, Republicans are much more affected than Democrats, right? But you see a positive effect of children in 2007 across all groups. In 2010, we find the same pattern, though the effect of the child frame is really not significant for Democrats. Democrats are the blue right here, right? And although you see it go up, it's not statistically significant, meaning we can't rule out the fact that it may not necessarily be true. In 2012, we find that the child wording again increases for Democrats this time, but interestingly for Republicans, support goes down when you mention children, right? So what's happening there? Part of this may be due to the fact that during that election year, Republican elites took very clear stances against immigration and against the DREAM Act, especially during the party primaries when this survey was what we call in the field, when it was being taken. However, in 2014, we do not find any moderating effects at all, so none of these groups actually differed, right? And bipartisanship, which means all the partisan groups reacted similarly to the frame. So what you see in this slide is the wording of the question that we used for the deferred action experiment, right? Obama recently issued an executive order to defer deportations of, and we randomly give them, illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, and documented immigrants, one of the three, under the age of 30 who came to the United States before the age of 16, have lived here at least 5 years and are in school, are high school graduates, or military veterans. Such individuals will be allowed to apply for a 2-year work visa and will need to renew every 2 years. And then, randomly, either they didn't get anything else, or they received, some argue that this will only lead to amnesty. To what extent do you support or oppose this policy? Right, so that's kind of like the question that you would get. Again, responses on this one were measured on a 5-point scale from -2 to +2, and what we did is we recoded those numbers to -1 to +1. -1 being strongly disagree, and +1 being strongly support. So how does the inclusion of the word amnesty affect support for the DREAM Act and DACA? And it's pretty clear here. As expected, we find that the amnesty frame significantly undercuts support for both the DREAM Act, from 0.4 to 0.19, and for Obama's deferred action program, even more severely, right? Amnesty, if you're anti-immigration, is still effective, right? In our second chapter, and so that wraps up the DREAM Act. In our second chapter, we pivot to what we call comprehensive immigration reform. And this is the basket of all these different policies that were negotiated by that compromise group of senators, right, back in the mid part of the last decade, supported by President George W. Bush, Ted Kennedy, who's now passed away, and John McCain, who's still in there. It was a larger, again, there was a larger package of policies including the temporary guest worker program, increased funding for border enforcement, immigrant legalization, and the DREAM Act. While it enjoyed initial support in 2005 in the public, and as the media what happened was the media got a hold of this, especially grassroots conservative media, including Rush Limbaugh and Lou Dobbs and Glenn Beck, who came out vociferously against this package, right? Lou Dobbs went to the border and had his show at the border and just railed against this package week after week. It was, as someone who had to read the transcripts, this is why there was a lot there, and it was very interesting. But what happened was, it may not have been only the media, but it had a significant effect on undercutting public support, especially among Republicans, right? And the Congress kind of caved. While in 2006, the Senate passed the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill 62 to 36, the House refused to even grant it a negotiating committee so they could actually take it up in the House. So what that happens is when it passes the Senate, if the House doesn't pass the same piece of legislation, then they should appoint a conference committee. But the House Speaker at the time, right, Hastert, never actually appointed a conference committee. So the bill died, right? Then in 2007, a similar bill was introduced in May that again failed, and this time it didn't even get out of the Senate, right? So it didn't even need to get to the House this time. Finally, in 2013, again after the Democratic Party's resounding victory in those elections, CIR came up again, and yet like the previous two times, CIR went down to defeat passing the Senate in June of 2013, but again stymied in the Republican-controlled House, which refused to even consider a bill, right? So, the story about comprehensive immigration reform, I'm going to call it CIR, is that it's been able to navigate the Senate, which is kind of ironic in a sense, because the Senate is always very difficult to get anything like this through. But the Republican House has been the primary obstacle, because we have had, in the last two presidents supportive of this policy, a Republican and a Democrat, but the House has been very obstinate in its opposition to this. In particular, we focus on the amnesty pathway equivalency frame in the context of CIR. In the media analysis, to what extent do media stories on CIR include the word amnesty, include the word pathway, both terms, or neither? And later, will people report different levels of support for CIR when it's called amnesty as opposed to a pathway to citizenship? In this table here, we present the percentage of CIR stories which included the word amnesty with no pathway, pathway with no amnesty, neither term, or both terms. Okay? And looking at the combined years, and as expected, the inclusion of the word amnesty is highest for the two conservative outlets, Fox News and the Washington Times. Conversely, amnesty mentions are lowest for the more liberal news sources, Washington Post at 9% and MSNBC at 36%. Okay, this pattern is identical, even more pronounced when looking at the immigration stories that include amnesty but no pathway. That said, we did notice an abnormally high amnesty mention rate in stories in CNN. And you might wonder, CNN, yeah, pretty even and balanced kind of network, right? Why are the amnesty mentions so high there? Anybody having a clue about why there were so many amnesty mentions in CNN's network? These are all stories, these are all news transcripts in CNN, right? That were on like legalization. But in CNN, we had 53% of those stories with amnesty in them, right? A little bit weird. Well, Lou Dobbs was the reason, and so was Glenn Beck, right? So what we did is this came out in the qualitative reading of these news articles, and we went ahead and separated our data set looking at pre-Lou Dobbs and post-Lou Dobbs, right? And what we found was there's a huge difference there, right? With Lou Dobbs, there were almost 75% of those legalization stories that included amnesty. After he left the network, that plummeted to like 30-something, right? So just an interesting kind of table to show what happened there with CIR and how it transpired and what, the effect that Lou Dobbs had on the coverage of immigration reform back then. So in this slide here, I present the question wording for our CIR framing experiment. And I'm not sure if it helps necessarily for me to read, but the question was, if we can seal our borders and enforce existing immigration laws, we randomly give them either illegal, undocumented, or unauthorized immigrants should be given either the opportunity to become legal citizens or they get amnesty. Okay, these are randomly put in there. And then also, some say they're Republicans, some say Democrats, some say commentators on Fox News. If we can seal our borders and enforce existing immigration laws, illegal immigrants should be given either they get amnesty or an opportunity to become citizens. This was a separate survey. So this was in one survey in 2012, and we used that wording in 2007, 10, and 11. Okay? And does people getting the amnesty frame, now does that, that frame eventuate in any differences? And the answer is yes. In this figure, we plot the differences in support for legalization across the five different surveys, right? 5 different years. The scale ranges from -1 to +1. -1 being strongly opposed to +1 being strongly supportive. And what's striking from these results is that there is a large and very meaningful difference in support for legalization, depending upon issue framing, right? These are not small effects, and they are all significant, okay, statistically significant. Even in 2012, where we measure our smallest framing effect, the difference is still very meaningful here, right? A 0.5 point. That's like going from support to neutrality, or neutrality to opposition, or to support, okay? What about immigrant generation? What effect does it have, right, in moderating these effects? Do fourth-generation immigrants react differently than first-generation immigrants? And what we see in this graph here is the answer is, at least in this study in 2007, yes, immigrant generation did have an impact, where the framing effects were larger for fourth-generation immigrants than for first-generation immigrants. That said, well, so moving on, and I think I'm gonna, Hanko, what time is it?
What?
What time is it? Do we have?
It's, it's 3 o'clock now. But
So what I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to go ahead and kind of summarize some of the findings from the last 2 chapters, because I didn't realize it's going to take this long. But generally, our takeaway is this, right? And I didn't really even get into some of the data for the last chapter. But the answer to the question of, does it matter what you call them, right, in terms of policy support? And the answer is no. And we found this over a couple of different surveys. You call them illegal, undocumented, and unauthorized, right? It doesn't matter what you get. You get the same level of support. We also used illegal aliens in a survey as well, and we got the same results, which is kind of interesting because you would think that a group that got the word illegal aliens may be less supportive of, say, a pathway to citizenship than a group that was told it was about undocumented immigrants, right? So that's one of the hooks from our book. The other thing is, what you call them doesn't matter, but what you call the policy and the extra issue frames, the extra information you emphasize when you talk about the policy, that matters, right? So it's the arguments for and against deportation. It's what you call, it's amnesty or pathway to citizenship or opportunity, right? Those really matter. So policy names matter, and the information about the policy matters. This is relevant because in these surveys that are being done by Gallup and others, some of them ask, to what extent do you support the DREAM Act? And others say, to what extent do you support the DREAM Act, which grants a pathway to citizenship to children, blah, 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 right? You wonder why sometimes you have different numbers, right? A lot of these different numbers have a lot to do with the question wording, right? And this is kind of what we talk about throughout. So in terms of the implications, we find that public opinion on immigration specifically is very malleable, very changeable. Ways in which issues are framed, are very consequential for public opinion. Thus, current levels of support for many of these policies. So a lot of these policies actually enjoy a decent amount of support now in the polls. What it says is that support is not solid, right? It can be changed, right? Given sustained systematic framing strategies, right? Second, we also find that negatively toned frames are more effective than positive frames. So I didn't present this information, but the negative economic cost frame is more consequential than the positive cost frame. If you deport citizens, right, you might think of it in those both those different ways. It can cost the community when you deport those citizens because they lose their workers, they lose people that are buying things in that community, right? That's one cost frame, a positive. The negative cost frame is these immigrants, they cost taxpayers money, you know, and because they use services and they do all these things. And that frame was more consequential than the former. Finally, we also find that there is some, what we call heterogeneity in reaction to the frames. There's a bifurcation by party, right? There's some of that, but not a lot of that. And this division may increase if our political elites actually start to, you know, come to some type of an agreement on these different policies. If Democrats and Republicans, you know, actually decide that Democrats decide I'm against deportation, or I'm for a pathway to citizenship, the entire party, and the Republicans do the same, you may see the people follow, right? This is a top-down approach. So I guess with that, I could take a few questions, and if you want me to go back over some of the things that I presented, I can do that as well. But I didn't want to talk forever.
Before you start taking questions, we want to thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay.